This is an interview with Cornelia Oberlander. The date is March 15th, 1994, and the interview is taking place in her home in Vancouver. Good afternoon, Cornelia.
Good afternoon. I'm so glad you could come.
Thank you. Thanks so much for taking time to talk with me today about your life as a landscape architect in Canada. I wonder if we could begin perhaps with your early days and specifically where you were born and when.
I was born on June the 20th, 1924 in the Rhineland in Germany. The town is called Mülheim, M-U-E-H-L-M, Heim, H-M-U-E-L, and then Heim. Yes, I-M. Yeah, Ruhr, Ruhr, R-U-H-R.
Okay.
I was born to a father who was an engineer, and my mother a very famous horticulturist. And she devoted her time to make gardens for the young amongst the big factories of steel in the Rhineland.
Oh.
So I was very fortunate. I grew up in a big garden in Berlin. They moved to Berlin later. And I grew up in a big garden, and I was so lucky that I had my own bed, and I could grow what I liked, and I mostly grew peas and corn.
Was that because you like to eat them?
No, I liked the structure.
Really?
Yes.
Isn't that interesting?
I also, I ate the young corn. I didn't like the big corn. And as a young girl, I came in 1939 to America, young enough to attend school, Smith College, and Harvard University. My mother had a truck farm in New Hampshire, which grew the vegetables for the market in a small town, which during the war was very important because of trucking costs. So every morning in the summer, I would get our station wagon filled up with the vegetables that we raised on this farm. And so I learned a great deal about horticulture and crops early on.
Were you part of a large family? Were there a number of
No,
brothers
unfortunately,
and sisters?
my father had died in 1933 in an avalanche in Switzerland. And I just came with one sister.
And at this point in time, were there certain things that were happening to you that kind of determined your direction in landscape?
No, but I knew already from my 11th year on that I was wanting to be a landscape architect. And so when it came time to choose the college, I looked at a lot of catalogs of different colleges and found that Smith College had an interdepartmental major between architecture and landscape architecture, which prepared you for the Cambridge School. That was the girls' part, the women's part of Harvard. But when I finished Smith College, by that time, they had the courtesy to accept women.
At Harvard.
At Harvard, yes. So I went directly to Harvard, and I was very fortunate that I had chosen Smith College because it prepared me for my chosen career very well. I had also, my mother wanted me to apply at other places, such as the Ambler School of Horticulture, and I took one look at the school. Though it was a good school, I did not enjoy even looking at it too closely. So a friend of my father's, I don't know, should I drop some names?
Certainly.
Lillian M. Gilbreth, you know, who Cheaper by the Dozen family. My father had studied in 1926 with the Gilbreth family, scientific management. She took me to Smith College because one of her daughters was there. And so I went and had an interview and was accepted. So that was my first stepping stone of going towards my chosen profession.
Was there a conscious decision between horticulture and landscape architecture?
Yes, I knew right away that I wasn't going to be a horticulturist. I knew that I would have to learn some plants because you use them, but the design and the taking care of the land was always utmost in my mind.
And so you went to
Smith College, then to Harvard.
Yeah, and then to Harvard.
And I met my husband in my second year at Walden Pond on a picnic. And so now we've been together, married 41 years, and we know each other for 47 years. Can you imagine that?
Sometimes those years probably went by very quickly.
Yes, especially with raising all these children. We have 3 children. Judy, she born in 1956. She's an architectural historian, and she works at Simon Fraser University now on a city program, and is also doing work in preservation of buildings. She went to Smith, class of 78, and Columbia, class of 81.
Oh.
Then comes Timothy. He went to Queen's and also Queen's Medical School, and then to McGill to have a fellowship in pediatrics, and then a Harvard fellowship, and he's now assistant professor of pediatrics at UBC. His wife Julie is also a physician, and she works in the Department of Geriatrics in a clinic situation.
Both ends of the spectrum.
Both ends. And then we have a granddaughter, and she is 14 months old, and she calls me Omi.
Is that a special
name? And yes. And then we have Wendy, a younger one. She is an artist, and has worked in San Francisco and in Iceland and all over, and is mostly interested in installations.
Of what
installation? Well, the medium would be things she prefabricates. Like, for instance, she had a very interesting exhibition in San Jose for her thesis. She has her Master of Arts from San Jose and her undergraduate degree from Pomona. And she was quite perturbed that the apple orchards were all disturbed. So she made an installation to tell us about the apple orchards, and she had a wonderful walls arranged with apples and a video to show how these poor trees come down and houses are built. So her things are politically and socially important, and also environmentally.
I wonder where she gets that from.
Yes.
And so during the time that your family was growing, were you working as a landscape architect?
Well, I couldn't do too much because, I had 3 children in 3 years and 6 months. But before, between graduating from Harvard in 1947 and marrying in 1953, my husband wanted to establish himself a bit, and so he went to London to work on the London County Council. He was very interested in housing, and I went to work in Philadelphia for the Citizens Council on City Planning, and my duties there were to promote the understanding of city planning to the public, very much like what we do today. And also help people have a few playgrounds in the neighborhood and things like that. And so one day, an architect called Oskar Stonorov, Stonorov, yes, Oskar Stonorov, saw that I was designing a little playground, and he said, did you do that? Yes, I did. And he said, you come to my office and you design, you can design the Walter Reuther building in Detroit, the landscape for it. So I said, I've never been in Detroit. I don't know anything about Detroit. It's very cold there, I know. And so he said, oh, you can do that. You come at 5, and tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, I pick it up the drawing from the office and it'd be fine. So what do I know? I know only that junipers grow in Detroit. So I made an abstract design with grass and juniper, and he loved it and took it to Detroit, and it was built. So that was my first real work. Well, then he invited me to his office to do a housing project. It's called Schuylkill Falls. It's social housing for the Philadelphia Housing Authority. And soon afterwards, Lou Kahn invited me to his office to do another housing project called Mill Creek. In public housing, those two are very important. So if you want to spell Schuylkill Falls, it's Schuy. I have to do it myself, I think. Schuylkill Falls, SCHUYKILLFALLS. Okay. Housing, it's called, yeah? Yep. And the other was Mill Creek, MILL, and then capital CREEK, housing, West Philadelphia. That was with Louis I. Kahn, yes? Mm-hmm. And the other one was Oscar Stornoroff. Now, I'd never written a set of specs in my life. I had never done anything like it at all. So these people decided, that these two architects decided that they had to get me groomed for this. And they invited Dan Kiley, the famous landscape architect from Charlotte, Vermont, to work with me, to show me how to do this. Well, it turned out to be a most wonderful experience in my life. First of all, Lou Kahn and Oscar Stornoroff and Dan Kiley. And you ask here questions, who were the individuals who influenced you? Well, the most influential person in my life, I think, was at Harvard, Gropius, Walter Gropius, he was professor of architecture. And we had a lot of collaborative problems, so that I learned architecture and landscape as an interrelated subject. Mm-hmm. And then the next person is Lou Kahn, Oscar Stornoroff, and Dan Kiley. I mean, that was just magnificent. Mm-hmm. And so I think that Dan really made me understood that we should bring order into the landscape and yet let people experience the beauty of the landscape. And I went to his house in Charlotte, Vermont. He lived in the old Grenfell house, you know, the Arctic Explorer, yes, or above Lake Champlain in Charlotte, Vermont. He had 9 children, a wonderful wife. She went to Bennington, and she wrote poetry. And everybody did whatever they wanted in this house. So you never knew where you slept or not slept. And there came a goat in the morning to be milked to the kitchen, and that's how we had milk. Mm-hmm. And in his studio, we produced superb work. I still have the drawings and everything. It was so, this man is really set me up to be a landscape architect par excellence. He guided me, he helped me write the specs and showed me how to do it. So that is the influence. And I mean, I didn't choose him. The Lou Kahn and Oscar Stornoroff choose me to work with him. Mm-hmm. During the time in Philadelphia, I also did another housing project with him that was not low rent, but high rent, and the buildings are wedged into the landscape. And it says, architect Stornoroff proposed a single formula that met both problems. Preserve the character of the neighborhood, see that the buildings are well designed, don't crowd them, save the trees and hold the natural contours of the land. This will minimize present and future change and attract the best tenants today and tomorrow. Ian McCarg, who wrote the book on the site, lived there, and he said, Cornelia, your linden tree saw me through my most troubled times. His wife died, and he was left alone, you know, and he just loved the trees, yes? Mm-hmm. So that were the goals that were set there, and it was my task to execute this. And here it says in this article, the site slopes sharply, falling off more than 30 feet along its main road. It was and is thickly wooded with mature and well cared for trees, huge beeches, etc. Where grading threatened a fine tree, dry-laid stone walls were used to maintain the grade. While I organized all this, and I realized I had to retain everything. In all, architect Stonerov and landscape architect Hahn saved 90 magnificent trees, some of them nearly 100 years old. Mm-hmm.
And were those principles of design that you were using, were they based on what you had learned at Harvard, or were they based
They were based on my instinct. Of course, I learned at Harvard that we must preserve trees, you must build wing wall, but this kind of a huge estate like this was at that time, this is 1950, I think, yeah, mm-hmm. Was published in 56. I started that work in 1950. Yeah. Mm-hmm. That was not done too often. It's really an amazing thing.
And has that formed the basis for lots of other projects?
Yes, like Monteverdi here, which I did for Arthur Erickson. You really should take a look at it. Have you a car?
No.
No. I wish I had time to drive you there.
I'll come back to Vancouver.
Yes, because you should take that for the archives. I mean, there I worked for Arthur Erickson on this fantastic problem of preserving the trees, cutting out the dense woodland and making it possible that houses are wedged in between, just like this house mm-hmm. is wedged into the ravine. Mm-hmm. My husband and I did that in 1970. Mm-hmm. He's a very good architect.
If this house is an example of it, you're right. Uh-huh. This is beautifully sited,
isn't it beautiful?
I just haven't really looked around.
Yeah, I give you a little tour before we get going. Okay. Yeah, so the influence is really through my family, my mother, you know, growing up on a farm. Mm-hmm. And then...
do you think that that's a lot of the basic kind of... as you said, when I said, was it what you learned at Harvard? And you said, no, it was a basic instinct. Do you think that that instinct is an outgrowth of your
my youth? I'm sure.
Mm-hmm. And just what you saw and what you were surrounded by and maybe what felt good.
That's right, yes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that was buried there in your psyche. And then when it came time for you to do that sort of work, that's what came forward?
I think so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Along with somebody saying, well, here's the tools that you can use to do that. Now,
they awakened it with the tools, but it was there.
Yeah, the actual, the feelings were there. And probably the same with all landscape architects. There's probably this hidden vision.
Most likely.
Yeah,
that's why it's a profession that's absolutely suited to me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do you think a landscape architect is more of an artist than, than a technician?
That's why I was just now appointed to the Royal Canadian Academy of Arts. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think so.
Yeah.
Well, my great luck is, and I'll read it to you.
Is this that?
Oh, I am going again. I received the Smith College Medal, which is very rarely given. Mm. Landscape architect, designer of playgrounds, public servant. I will give you the sheet, but I'll read this now, and student of the modern city. At Smith, you found your calling as a student of architecture, art, and nature, and you have been true to its demands ever since. It took you to the Harvard School of Design, where you earned your bachelor's degree in landscape architecture in 1947, and has found full expression in your many contributions to the urban environment of Canada, of which you are a citizen. And then it goes on to say, these works bear witness to your mastery of your art and your ability to work creatively with architects and engineers, so that modern architecture can live in scale with its human tenets. It is your gift to solve with the eye of the artist the technical problems of bringing nature into easy relationships with steel and concrete. Isn't that magnificent? And you know who wrote that? All by herself. Jill Kerr Conway, who wrote The Road from Corrane. Have you read it?
No.
You must read it. Fabulous book. It tells about her childhood in Australia on a ranch and her breaking away from this Australian scene where women just don't ever reach fulfillment.
Mm-hmm.
And she was president of Smith College when I got the medal.
Isn't that wonderful?
Here it is. It's designed by Leonard Baskin. It's designed by Leonard Baskin, and it is Justitia. And here are the virtue, knowledge, and knowledge, to virtue and knowledge. Isn't that wonderful?
That's beautiful, isn't it?
Yeah. It's great, isn't it? And my husband set it into this beautiful frame. I must take it back, I think.
I'm sorry.
Local about it.
Would you mind repeating some of that information? I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm. Well, Linda, my feeling is that if we are trained correctly, we are trained to think conceptually. And we can apply our knowledge to any site in the world, because the site has to speak to us, and that's called the spirit of the place. And that makes us solve the way the land fits to a building or the land can be used.
So does that mean
that you can do it anywhere?
Is there Canadian landscape architecture and American landscape architecture then?
No, it's all the same. The climate makes the landscape architecture look different, but the solutions, the way your brain works, the way you establish the goals for land are universal, international. That's how I see it.
Is the difference perhaps then simply one of plant material?
Oh yes, the regions determine your plant material. Here I use different plant material than I do back in Toronto. And in Toronto I use different plant material than I do in Ottawa. But it's still landscape architecture.
The process is the same. Would you say that that's the same regardless of, we've just said United States and Canada, how about Turkey, Burma, Australia?
In Australia, I've done some work. I approach it with the same kind of idea, only I use different plant material to solve my planting plans.
What about the cultural differences? Does that come into play in your work?
Yes, it does, because in countries where the culture is very different from our norm, you have to think yourself about how people will use the landscape. Yes, there you would do it differently. But the process is still the same. I here also have people participating. I will give you a paper called How Architecture Meets the Trees. And I have just been to Japan recently on a symposium, and the landscape is different. They use it differently. The plants are different, not so different from here, but from Eastern US or Canada. But they would solve it also with conceptual ideas, and also the ideas of finding the spirit of the place. And the spirit of the place is largely due to the fall and rise of the land, but also how people would like to use it. And you have to study that if you work in different countries.
A minute ago, you had the plaque that you prepared with the medal from Smith College. It occurs to me that a very significant part of your career is the fact that you are a woman. were there any problems that you encountered in the early days, or
Never.
even no?
No, I just forged ahead. I never thought of it, and you would believe it. Betty Friedan, who is the great creator of women's lib, was in my house at Smith College. She was a senior while I was a freshman. And everybody would sit around at night talking to Betty Friedan about women's working and women's lib and all the stuff. And I just poked my nose in and said, if you all want to work, just get to work, you'll do it. And that's how I approached it. I think that I've never felt shut out because I was a woman.
And you haven't ever encountered any prejudice against you?
Not that I was noticing it, because I'm so excited when I get a new job, I just charge ahead.
Some of the gentlemen that I have spoken with on this project have indicated that there are certain roles that women play, and they certainly haven't indicated that it's an equal role with that of the men in the profession. So it's interesting to hear that you say these things that you haven't come across.
Well, I choose very definitely to do certain types of work, such as low rent housing. I've done it in America. I've done it in Canada. I did Skeena Terrace housing here and McLean housing in Vancouver. It's all low rent housing. Mm-hmm. So I worked with architects. I always work very closely with architects. I see that the buildings and site fit better together if you work early on in the architect's office, not when you get a finished drawing. So also the architects that I've worked with had always women architects in their offices. And so I think I was fortunate to find no prejudice. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure that you worked as a female landscape architect for a number of years before there were any other female landscape architects. Were you the only?
Well, when I came here in Philadelphia, there was maybe very few landscape architects that were women, mm-hmm. and they mostly did gardens. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that seems to be the category that most men that I've talked with think that where women should be. That,
mm-hmm. Well, I don't think so.
Yeah.
Now, I'd like to tell you that when students call me and they want role models, so we talk about how I got there, why I am, and I said, you as landscape architects have a great deal to contribute. You could be doing the broad stroke landscape, the macro landscape, or else you would be doing just a segment of the profession, such as playgrounds, such as gardens, rooftop gardens, for a while till your children grow up. And then you must spread your wings and get fully into the profession. Mm-hmm. And there is room for you. I tell it to them. Mm-hmm. You must have interviewed very peculiar people. Yeah.
We'll talk about that when we turn the tape recorder off.
Yeah, I'd like to do that.
Going back to your education, your schooling days, mm-hmm. It has been said to me by someone that you are a true modernist in terms of landscape design.
I am.
What does that mean to you?
Well, true modernist. Okay. I grew up in the graduate school of design when Professor Gropius was the head of architecture. That was definitely the time of modern architecture as explained in Henry Russell Hitchcock's book on architecture, which you probably know very well. And that style of architecture came to us through an exhibition in 1932 with Philip Johnson and Henry Russell Hitchcock at the Museum of Modern Art. And I certainly grew up in that style. And my first gardens are certainly very studied abstract designs, and I'll show you one or two afterwards. I did one of them with Professor Lasserre here at the School of Architecture in 1953. So modern, meaning that I use paving, that my gardens are structured, and that the garden and the house are an extension of the built form. They must melt together, if you get what I am after. And I work together well with architects because I understand architecture, having first of all worked for many architects, but secondly, when I got to Harvard Architecture School, it was customary that I had to take a year of architecture before I was ever admitted into landscape architecture. And the most important item about landscape architecture is not what you plant, but how you relate the building to the site and how you grade. Grading is more important than what you plant. And so I had a wonderful professor at Harvard, and if you ask me who influenced me to that, was this professor who said, "Oh, Cornelia, just go on and sculpt the earth and you can make very nice forms. And if we go through this place here, I'll show you what I did and what is so different from everybody else."
What did he mean by sculpting the earth? Well, I guess it was a he, was it?
Yes, of course it was a he. I never met a professor who wasn't there. Well, you see, most ground is flat and very dull. But if you take the earth from the excavated sites and suddenly make a mounded landscape, you have between the two mounds a place to go through. So you're sculpting the earth, you're making something, a land form that is more beautiful. And that's where my artistry comes in.
And are those the kinds of principles that you have based many of your designs on?
Yes. Yes.
Sculpting. Would that include, for instance, when we were talking a minute ago about the National Gallery?
Well, yes. In the National Gallery, if you went to the back, did you go to the Winter Garden there? There's a Winter Garden. There is a big alley of oak trees between the War Museum, and then there's this relationship between the two buildings, the administration building and the National Gallery, and then there's a huge hill that goes up to Nepean Point Park. Where is the magazine that I gave you?
Right.
Here, on this here,
yes,
is the this is the Winter Garden between the War Museum and the gallery. Here is a minimalist crab apple courtyard with rocks and just crab apples. And then you are ascending a very steep hill. And I sculpted, and this path is called the Op Art Path, and it lies in sculpted, contoured ground. It's very dramatic. This is the art of op art, this is minimalism, and this is the impressionistic art of Canada. So I have 3 different art forms here.
And what would, while we're talking about that particular site, where did those basic ideas come from? What sort of
for each one of my projects, I come with a concept. I never start a job without having a total concept. Already when I was so young, if I reread what I read to you on this Jericho business, I had goals to preserve the trees and nestle the buildings in between. And those goals I use on many sites. But now on the National Gallery, I knew that they had different forms of art in their galleries. And therefore I wanted to express other art forms in the out of doors and relate the building with these art forms to each other, to the site and to the public who came to visit.
Mm-hmm.
That's
giving another expression
yes.
of art or minimalism
Yes.
to
Yes.
for people to
Mm-hmm.
understand.
Yeah.
Has your work been the inspiration directly for other landscape architects that you know of?
No, I don't think so.
Oh.
I couldn't judge that. I wouldn't know. There are people who call me up and said, we were so inspired what you've done. I cannot say I've ever seen something. Oh, yes. I've seen something that inspired me so much that I thank you for it. No, I've never heard that yet, except once. I went this year to the opening of a little park in Burnaby, and it was done by my former assistant. You will meet Elizabeth in a little while, and I think you should talk to her a little bit, because I don't know how I see myself amongst my peers. And Kate Clark, who worked with me for many years, and also in the National Gallery, she did all the calculations of how plants and so on, I mean, as my assistant. She did a small little park in Burnaby, and she said, Cornelia, I could have never done that had you not inspired me. So that was the first time I heard that said.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
But your work has such a high profile in Canada and in the United States that it must be, even though people aren't saying anything, that they must be
yes.
You
ask other people about that.
Okay.
I don't.
And I think of, for instance, the Canadian Embassy in Washington, D.C. I'm sure that there's people who have been influenced by your concepts there.
Oh, yes, because you see, they have learned that their sites are limited and that you got to do something on the building. But I have not seen any good copy of it yet. Mm-hmm. Nor have I ever seen Arthur Erickson's Robson Square copied any place. Mm-hmm. Do you see? Mm-hmm. These are things that we've often wondered about it. Yeah. But people come and are very much enjoying Robson Square. Have you walked through it?
I haven't. I've just seen photographs.
But go. Where are you staying? In the Coast Plaza.
Yes.
Well, that isn't so far from Robson Square. You really should treat yourself to walk through it, and then you catch on to what Cornelia does yes. with Arthur Erickson. I mean, you see, yeah. I could never have come to this had I not these architects that really were so inspirational. Mm-hmm. I mean, Arthur Erickson is so inspirational, so is Moshe Safdie. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And wonderful that you're able to establish the kind of working relationship that you've
yes.
had, that they can help to inspire you, but that they also respect what you do.
Well, this is, yes.
Move forward. What do you think are, say 10, or it doesn't matter the number, but what do you think are the major works that you have done in Canada?
Well, I saw this there on this thing, so let's go through it.
Okay.
I think the major contribution is the garden of the Friedman Garden. Why don't I just hook it off here?
Okay.
Just give me a minute.
Okay, sure.
And you know, here I have a huge bibliography.
Okay.
Yeah, you can enjoy that, yeah? Mm-hmm. And I'm sure you can find some of these things. Now let's see how we are doing here. 1992, professional awards. We don't need to do that. Okay, residence of Dr. and Mrs. Friedman. That is one of the most delightful gardens, and they have kept this up for 40 years exactly as designed. And that happens very rarely, because landscapes very often owner changes mind and so on. Oh no, they saw it as a work of art, and it's still today. So that maybe Elizabeth gives you a lift and okay. You can stop off. Then came Citizens Council on City Planning, 53. Well, then this is Philadelphia. Then the next stepping stone of a first public building was the faculty club at the University of British Columbia, and unfortunately they have ruined it because they weren't good to it. In terms of housing, these housing projects at the time were very impressive and very exciting. It was a time of public housing, so I hooked those off, yes? Then comes, with my husband, I did a town for leisure in Kona, Hawaii. Do you know Kona?
Very well.
Do you know Keahu Bay?
Keahu Bay?
Keahu Bay, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, my husband and I, we did the planning for that.
Oh, yeah, I stayed at the Keahu Beach Hotel a number of times.
Yes,
I know that area very well.
Yeah, so we planned the town for leisure there. Yes, and the golf course. And that golf course was designed also with the concept, namely, the first tree that you find there is the palm tree, the coconut palm. And as you go higher and higher into Mocha. Yes, not Mocha. Yeah, as you go higher up, you find the flamboyant and the jacaranda and everything. So I created a regional landscape for this whole thing as a concept. And they planted it up exactly like that. So that was influential. So we have already 5. But then I would like to tell you, in terms of Canada, maybe the most influential project of the 60s was the playground for the Children's Creative Center at Expo 67. You know about that?
No, tell me about it.
Well, it was a center in which art, music, and drama was taught to the children. It was situated in the lower portion of the Canadian Federal Pavilion at Montreal. And I was commissioned in 1965 to design the playground for it. And instead of just making a playground with swings, slides, and teeter-totters, I'd observed my children, and my son loved to play with mud and water and sand. And so I made a huge canal. I made mounds for them, a tunnel which they could have a little pickaxe and go inside and chop for coal and have loose parts to play with. So that playground then led the way for I made 50 playgrounds after that and occupied myself completely with playgrounds. And then my aunt came to visit in 1974 one day, and she sat right here from New York, she came. And she said, "Oh, Cornelia, I think it's time you did something else but playgrounds." So I said, "But what shall I do? I can't do anything else. I just can do playgrounds." And a week later, Bing Tong from Arthur Erickson's office called me and asked me to participate on Robson Square. Can you believe it? So here I sat, he had interviewed me, and I had to have a proposal the next day ready at 10 o'clock, what I would do. And I said, I want to re-import nature into the city and create areas where everybody feels good. That was the gist of it. Well, I got the job the next morning, and I said, I can only take this job if I come at 9:30 and I have to go home at 2:30 because I still have 3 at home. And so they agreed that I would do that. And so I got the job.
What year was that?
74. So I worked for Arthur on Robson Square. Robson Square, where is that? Here's Robson Square. But then I did the Bob Berwick Memorial Center, and Wanda was the head teacher there. She knows all about that. She knows about that nice playground. It's hardly much destroyed now.
Wanda Justice?
Yeah. And here's Robson Square. Okay, that is probably the kingpin of the business. And then your Museum of Anthropology you got to see.
Yes.
Yeah, so that I did. And so here we are at Robson Square. And there's lots written about it, and you can read about it from my bibliography in here. Okay. And then comes, then of course comes the National Gallery of Canada and the Canadian Chancery. Those were the really great things, yes? But what I'm doing now is absolutely fabulous. Why? Of course, I won the design with Moshe Safdie for the library. That's another great thing.
Where is that?
In Vancouver. It's a building on the corner of Georgia and Hamilton Street. You really should see that. It's just rising out of the ground. I'm just going to embark onto the working drawings. And then another very important building is the Northwest Territories Legislative Assembly building in Yellowknife. And Ottawa City Hall is good. Canadian Chancery is good. 1, 2, 3. And Monteverdi, that you've got to look at, because Monteverdi Housing, oh, this awful telephone. Monteverdi Housing is one of the first housing estates here where we wedged the trees, where we wedged the houses amongst the trees, and we cut out the trees with windows so you can see a little bit of the mountains and the water. And I did that also for Arthur Erickson. So here you have, well, if you look at this list, it's rather funny. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 buildings that set the stage for other things, yeah? But the 12th one is the Institute of Asian Research at UBC, an environmentally responsible building and landscape, with the architects are Matsusaki Wright Architects. And that's what I'm working on now. And I will be presenting this at the conference. Will you be there on Thursday?
If you're presenting it, I will be.
Yes, please do, because I'm going to not do it now.
Okay, what time on Thursday?
8:40, I think at 10:30.
Oh, okay. All right.
I look it up before you go. And if you, I give you a sheet on it.
Okay.
The research that we did for this environmentally responsible building is just beyond beyond anybody's. Giving the speech on.
Okay. Yes.
And this building is an environmentally responsible building. In 1993, we had workshops to set the stage for the goals for this building. You see, we had 2 workshops, and we established the goals by which we designed this building. We reviewed the term sustainable. Sustainability came to us through the Environmental Conference of Stockholm in 1972. It was further illuminated in Common Future, the report by the Brundtland Commission. And that is the most important part of landscape architecture today, namely that we continue to develop without robbing the land for future generations. And I see landscape architects being facilitators in order to be able to help other professions to understand this. And that is the future of our profession, and it's very exciting. And I'm very honored that the University of British Columbia, under the leadership of Freda Pagani, she's a most remarkable woman, selected this team that you see here. Here's the team with all environmentally conscious professionals. And what we have achieved, you will see in this little presentation that I will give. So that leads me to telling you a little bit about the past of you have a lot of reading to do, and you can ask me maybe in Victoria once more. When I got the honorary degree from the University of British Columbia, I spoke about the decade of the 80s, which was often called the decade of excess, the me generation. The decade of the 90s is emerging as a decade of global survival and of learning to share locally and to cooperate globally. The current favorite phrase, sustainable development, was coined at the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment in Stockholm in 1972. It has challenged us to develop a holistic and constructive approach to the growth based on economic developmental objective. Norway's Gro Brundtland, in her seminal report, Our Common Future, has given sustainability a fashionable ring. We talk about sustainable forests, sustainable agriculture, even sustainable cities. I'm quoting from my speech. Mm-hmm. The concept is a modest one, and we have to go beyond it. We have to aspire to much more. Sustainability, even when carefully defined, is a minimum position because it considers the universe and its ecological environment as a static or fixed end state. As we consume resources and space itself through development, we also consume time. All of it has to be replaced systematically and comprehensively. We have to aim at restoring or replacing the total environment we consume, not merely sustaining it. And based on that, I think is the future of landscape architecture.
In what particular ways can that be carried out by landscape architects?
Yes. For instance, on this building of Institute of Asian Research, we will have self-composting toilets, which means we are not putting sanitary, we're not using sanitary sewer. We have a hookup in case of emergency, but it is not needed. That self-composting toilet will be emptied once a year, and the compost will be put on to ground. It's usable for amending soil. We will catch all the water from the wash basins. It will be cleaned biologically in a wetland. And if everybody will do that, and cities will commit themselves to this type of biological engineering, then we would not have problems such as too much sewer down into the sea.
Mm-hmm. And the wasting of resources.
Yes,
yeah.
And also when you see a site, don't fell the trees. Do what is on the ground. Do not import high-tech air conditioning units into buildings. Use windows that can open. Mm-hmm. Clean the air inside of a building with plants that can absorb the pollution. NASA has done tremendous amount of work on it, and I've been networking in the last year with all these people that have done that work, so that this building will be environmentally friendly. Sustainability involves meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations. And is this possible? I asked myself. And so I said, this is where your and my professional responsibility begin for the 90s. And that is being practiced. UBC professors have done projects with the students on that, and it's very interesting. Mm-hmm. Do my other people see the future like that?
Everyone sees it differently. Are there other areas that you think are significant for the future that landscape architects can play a major role in?
Yes, in helping, for instance, visually to keep the open countryside. These are recreation areas for people. They can be used still for farms, but you have to bring somehow the people from the city to have this recreational resource, and it is probably visual rather than physical.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. In New Zealand, they have right-of-ways between the farms so that people can hike in the country between the farms. We might have to consider something like that. Mm-hmm.
I think
and landscape architects are eminently qualified to work on this type of recreational use, also of parks and so on.
Yes. What are the capabilities or the skills that landscape architects can bring to some of these developments for the future? How are they better suited than an architect or an engineer?
Well, an architect, yes. Well, I think the landscape architect would be maybe the leader of such a team, and the biologists are needed on these teams. Also, a engineering firm that understands sustainable development. And so I think it's more and more teamwork, and that's what we're doing on the Institute of Asian Research.
Mm-hmm. And how can some of these concepts be used to influence the rest of the world?
Well, you have to write about it. You have to speak about it, as I will on Thursday. And more people will then understand what we're trying to do. Mm-hmm. And this is a public relations work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Very much so.
Yeah.
And what's involved with that in terms of the global community? Do you see, you mentioned that 90s are the time of global survival.
Yes. Well, it's for everybody, whether it's Africa, Europe, or us. Everybody has to learn to use less water, use less fuel, use less electricity. And where is my book here? If you read the Globe and Mail, there is always a thing on Earthwatch. There's Holland's grassroots movement, and that's a little town in Ecolonia, where they're having 101 units, which architects and planners designed. Environmentally correct buildings for decades with the goal of saving water, fuel, trees, and limiting the spread of hazardous chemicals. So all over the world, people are doing this now. They are still doing it in pockets, but we have to do it all over.
Do you think, is there some way that people that are doing all of these things could communicate?
Of course, we are communicating through technical magazines, and we are communicating through lectures, radio programs, newspaper articles, and so forth. Yes, we're trying to get this out in the forefront. Mm-hmm.
Is that an area where an organization like IFLA could play a role?
Tremendous. And the Canadian Society of Landscape Architects, when I was president, I got onto the podium and I told them that the environment was of utmost importance. Yes, I think and networking with other people. Mm-hmm. And I was very fortunate when I was president of the Canadian Society of Landscape Architects to talk to the American counterparts. And you will meet Roger Martin. Have you met him? He's coming. And he can tell you how I came before the board of directors asking that we work together on environmental problems. And the American Society of Landscape Architects, God bless them, has put together what I hoped the Canadian Society of Landscape Architects would do, and I'm going to applaud my friend Larry Patterson.
Okay, good.
Namely, to put out a declaration of the environment and development, and I will be reading about this. The following principles reflect the fundamental and long-established values of the American Society of Landscape Architects. Many of these principles were re-emphasized in the 1992 Rio Declaration on Environment and Development, the health and well-being of people, their cultures and settlements. Future generations have a right to an environment which at least the same qualities and quantities of environmental asset as this present generation. Long-term economic progress and the need for environmental protection must be seen as a mutually interdependent. And landscape architects commit themselves to accept responsibility for the consequences of our design, planning, management, and policy decisions on the health of natural systems and cultural community and their harmony, equity, and balance with one another. And that is the future for our profession. I will have a few sheets Xerox for you.
Okay.
because you've got to read a little bit more.
Do you think that there are things that could mitigate against that in terms of, for instance, money? Is that sort of a problem that landscape architects face if a client comes to them wanting particular kinds of things, and that's where?
Well, I don't take clients like that. Finished. I mean, if somebody, I'm doing something in Toronto and I'm telling these people all the time, I'm not going to do plants with high water intensive needs. I'm going to do low water intensive needs. If you want to have a light in your house, I'm going to have low voltage. So I educate my client. I don't take jobs where they do that. That's another thing I don't do.
What about someone who, has to pay the rent and it's a very, that particular job is really critical to their staying alive that month?
Well, I've resigned from jobs. For instance, I was on a job where somebody cut a very important tree, a heritage tree. I resigned. But then luckily I have a husband who keeps me fed. Yeah, so that's different.
But I think what you've said just now is critically important, in that perhaps one of the important roles for landscape architects in the future is that they become the educators of their clients.
Yes, and previously I told you that they're not only educators but also facilitators for teamwork, because they, by their instinct, know more about the land, about the out of doors, and how to deal with it.
And perhaps also are capable of looking at a particular project in a more global sense.
Yes.
And I don't mean world globally,
no,
but
global,
just in a larger,
more in a larger context. Yes.
So that they can pull together what the architect or engineer is doing. What you were just reading from the ASLA declaration, do you feel that that's the same kinds of things that should be said by the CSLA? Or
yes,
would you
similar. I mean, very similar. Yes, I think I would go through this word by word with them, and I would discuss this with them. Here it says, develop, use, and specify products, materials, technology, and techniques which exemplify the principles of sustainable development and landscape regeneration. I mean, that nobody even in Canada can quibble. They might like to express it differently. But that is why I think there is no difference. And why the difference is in the regions, the plant material, the climate, and so forth.
At this point in time, there's a very major chasm that's developed in the worldwide Landscape Architecture Federation. And I'm sure that you're very well aware of the difficulties. And one of them is that IFLA, as an organization, has some problems. I won't say that it's disintegrated, but there are some problems. Do you think that ideas like this are things that could perhaps unite that group again?
Well, I think that somebody very big has to come and sit down, and I think it's Peter Jacobs. And Peter Jacobs is certainly serves on all the big world environment and conservation committees. Have you talked to him?
Well, not an interview, but yeah.
But isn't he brilliant? I mean, brilliant. He is the one who could do it. And I've urged Larry and everybody strongly to let him try. Pay his way and let him try, because IFLA is needed. We can't do it just by ourselves.
The unfortunate problem right now that exists is that the United States, as a very major part of IFLA, has broken away. And they're not only large in numbers, but more significantly, perhaps, in terms of dollars in support of IFLA, and have on their side both Australia and Great Britain, and Canada's kind of sitting on the fence at the moment. What do you think Canada should do in that situation?
Well, Canada could help to get them together, but I think that if we, the ASLA and the CSLA, get together, then we have the Mexicans as friends, and then we have the NAFTA group. And I see that as very powerful. And if we then manage to get the other European countries together by sitting down and talking to them, and I think Peter Jacobs is the only one who could do it, maybe we get going again. But we need a global outlook, and we need more people from Africa and India to become landscape architects, and that is an education necessity, where monies have to be found for just that.
And those are some of the initiatives that an international organization could undertake.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that that international organization still needs to be called IFLA?
No, could have a new name. It could be a whole new group. But I'm thinking of a global group.
Yeah.
And I've just been to Japan in November, and they're certainly wanting to know a great deal about sustainable development and about how we can green our cities. And environmental questions are higher on the priority, and they would certainly join a global group.
Mm-hmm.
We can't stick all together, but this is the future of the profession.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd be glad to make available to you my speech if you would like to read it in toto, if you bring it back to me.
Sure. Thank you very much. Okay.
Well, now I tell you a historic moment. My husband, of course, was Canadian, is Canadian, also like me, came to this country as a young man, and he went to McGill Architecture School and then to study community planning at Harvard, and then worked for Humphrey Carver at Central Mortgage and Housing in the think tank division.
Mm-hmm.
And in 1949, he was sent by Central Mortgage and Housing to go through the country and look at wartime housing. Should they remove it or should they make it permanent?
Mm.
And so he arrived on a beautiful day here in Vancouver in May. Now everything was blooming and he was so happy and the sun was shining, and he said, "I'd like to stay here." But of course he had a contract with Central Mortgage and Housing to do this type of work, so he couldn't get away. But he was asked to present a paper on the education of planners in this country to a royal commission. And on that commission sat the then president of the University of British Columbia, Larry Mackenzie. And Larry Mackenzie said to Peter after the presentation, "Will you come to my university, my boy, and teach this subject?" And so Peter laughed and said no, he was engaged by Central Mortgage and Housing Corporation. He couldn't come. So a year elapsed, and Peter then was asked to come to BC, and he started in the Department of Architecture, then built up the Department of Community and Regional Planning here at UBC. He was director of it till 1970, when he was asked by Trudeau to become the Deputy Minister of Urban Affairs. And so we moved to Ottawa for a while. And his doctor's thesis was Housing and Planning, Stepchildren of Canadian Federalism. And it's well known that he tried to find solutions with the British North America Act so that the cities could be funded directly and not just via the provinces, which make us starve. So that was his doctor's thesis at Harvard. And he was writing this from 1954 to 1956. We were living in New York, and all of a sudden we get a telephone call in New York by Helen Kippax and Francis Blue. Would you come to me to give a speech to the Canadian Society of Town Planning, Town Planners? It was called Community Planning Association, no, to the
Canadian Society of Landscape Architects.
Community, of Town Planners. Would you give a speech to them on landscape architecture? So I said I would. This article is based upon an address given to the Canadian Society of Landscape Architects and Town Planners in Toronto on December 12th, 1955. For permission to publish it, the review is grateful to both Mrs. Oberlander and the CSLA. And there was Helen Kippax and Francis Blue meeting me at the railroad station in Toronto. I'd come on the overnight train from New York with a little suitcase. And then I gave the speech, and you read it.
Wonderful.
And here I said, the principles on which one should design were based, of course, on my knowledge of Olmsted. Mm-hmm. And he said, preserve natural scenery and, if necessary, restore and emphasize it. And that's pretty much of what we're still doing today. And then I talk about the client and the community, about my work in Philadelphia. This was my first playground that I designed in Philadelphia with a new kind of equipment that I designed. Uh-huh. And
but is that like an arched?
Yes, climber. Yes, mm-hmm. Instead of the jungle gym, this was arched, and the children fell on sand instead of the hard asphalt. Mm-hmm. And then I showed them slides of how houses were placed amongst trees in Stockholm, or so. And then I said, landscape architecture in Canada. Canada today is enjoying an unprecedented economic development. Whereas in 1900, 6 out of 10 people lived on farms, today the reverse is true. 6 out of 10 people live and work in cities without ready access to the country and open spaces. That was 1955. Our leisure hours are increasing. That's not true today. Mm-hmm. I haven't had any. In a few years.
That's your choice.
Yes. I love my profession, so I don't mind. In a few years, we may see the 4-day work week. Thus, the need for more parks and a variety of open spaces increases rapidly. We must start to plan for this need before all of the suitable land is assigned to other uses. For all this work, the landscape architect must be prepared. Let me stress the dire need for more and better landscape architects trained at home. Professionals ought to be ready to meet the demands of this growing country and to cope with the new client, the public. Schools have been founded in Canada to train architects and town planners, but none to train landscape architects.
And do you really think that is, when you're saying that they should be trained in Canada?
Yes.
You think that's viable?
Very good.
What's the necessity?
Well, because we have to train people locally. We can't train them in the US all the time. Thank you. May I introduce you to Linda? In landscape architects at home. Yes, of course we must. Because people don't have the money to go to school to different places. I mean, that's obvious.
But also studying
the regional aspects.
But do you think, earlier you said that kind of design concepts were...
Yes, but you can apply them anywhere, but you got to train some people someplace first, yes. Mm-hmm. And that's very important. And then when your brain functions, you can work anywhere. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, continue.
Schools have been founded in Canada to train architects and town planners, but none to train landscape architects. There should be a school where students are taught fundamentals of design, contemporary architectural principles, a thorough understanding of site planning and site engineering, a knowledge of plant materials, and above all, understanding of teamwork. Here I talked about teamwork already then. I'm still at it. Through the work of landscape architects trained in this manner, their profession will achieve a status commensurate with its social importance. Architects today are reluctant to hire landscape architects for fear that they are mere tree and shrub decorators. This misconception can only be remedied if landscape architects are trained to work with architects, town planners, and engineers as members of the team. I hope that in the near future, at least one of our Canadian universities will establish professional courses in landscape architecture related to courses in architecture and town planning to train young men and women in a wide open, very exciting field. To be successful, we must, as a group, produce a contemporary philosophy of design, just as Repton and Olmsted did before us. We might voice our thoughts through a journal published 3 or 4 times a year. Such a journal might be sent to other interested groups, architects, town planners, and home builders. This might help to bring about a better understanding of landscape architecture and might contribute to the full recognition of our profession.
And it was sometime after that before school was.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Wasn't it? So I called for that in 1955. Mm-hmm. So in all the writings, this had never been mentioned, but I said these words. And Francis Blue, little article in the Landscape magazine didn't mention this, but and Humphrey didn't mention this. So I think it should be in the oral history.
Yes.
It's my
Yes,
thought and my contribution, but and it's my husband who encouraged me to say that and wrote me a note how to cloak it.
Good, that's wonderful. I just went blank.
Yeah, I have to get going in a few
Okay,
minutes.
all right.
Yeah, what else should we talk about? There's so much, you know.
Well,
these are 45 years of work.
And you can't do it in an hour and a half, that's for sure. What do you feel that, in terms other than sort of specific kinds of locations, you've indicated here that you said in 1955 there should be schools. What do you feel are your other contributions to the profession? Do you feel you've contributed in a philosophical way?
Yes, I think so, through my writing. Why don't you ask this to Elizabeth? I'll ask her to come for a minute. She knows more.
Well, I want to know what you have to say. Well, I think...
yes, my philosophy, of course, to explore the spirit of the place, to keep the vegetation and to work with native materials. That, I think, is something. And that's very important for the future. Here are my goals, which I wrote. Here you may read those. And yeah, goals for environmentally sustainable landscapes are: all design must be in harmony with nature. The building and landscape must respond to the issues of ozone depletion, global warming, indoor and outdoor air pollution. Native and or indigenous plants have to be used in order to have as little maintenance as possible. If street trees are needed in our cities, we should think of those that will absorb outdoor pollutions. That is, above all, the ginkgo tree. Indoor plants have to be chosen in buildings that have no air conditioning to absorb indoor air pollutants. And that has been researched by NASA. And I would encourage that people have the green workplace indoors. Do not strip topsoil. Topsoil is a misnomer. It doesn't exist. Use the soil from the site and amend it with organic matter from the grounds, from the grounds nearby, such as humus from collected leaves. This will reduce the environmental impact of transportation or imported material. Do not use chemical fertilizer. Do not use pesticides. A water-efficient subsurface irrigation system should be installed on all projects based on the principle of xeriscaping, which is a method that conserves water and protects the environment. This system can be activated by a low-voltage computer clock. Do not use electricity in great manners. Recycle, for instance, lamp standards and make them energy efficient in the out of doors. Use wastewater from sinks to irrigate the out of doors. And that can be done by having a subsurface biological marshlands. And these marshlands are usually made with gravel and lined with bentonite, which is a benign clay product, which is self-sealing, so no water seeps out. The marshlands then are planted with plants that will be acting as biological filters, such as cattails and reeds. So when the water is then cleansed by these roots of the plants, then you can use it for irrigation. So this storage of stormwater and gray water use is increasingly important. And do not You do not use concrete, for instance. Use for recycled paving material for sidewalks. All that kind of work is the work of our future. Here you have it.
Okay, well, I think we'll stop there for now, but I hope that we'll be able to continue as required.
Well, you got the future role of landscape architects with the, what do you see as the future of the profession in Canada? Well, I see a great future as facilitators of teams. And the profession has changed. The landscape architect used to just sit there and put his trees down. Well, I never did that. I refused to. I always thought of a concept. I always thought of the relationship of the building to the site. Okay, I think we've done a lot.
Thank you very, very
You're
much.
welcome.
That's wonderful.
Okay, go ahead. As a landscape architect, I strive to achieve meaningful fractions of the global garden by bringing nature into the city and maintaining the city within the context of nature. In my profession, I concern myself with achieving, among others, the following goals for each site: to discover, develop, and exploit its genius loci, its ecological uniqueness and representative familiarity. This is, for instance, the familiar forest, and then the ecological balance between the built environment and the natural environment. To encourage the user's participation and essential design ingredients in making choices to produce environments that achieve diversity, variety, and user satisfaction. To conceptualize and develop open space systems which range from public to semi-public and private open spaces, especially when responsible, enlightened elected officials foster these ideas and make it mandatory that planners, architects, and landscape architects work together as a team from conceptual design to implementation to continuing maintenance. Very important. We are not maintaining our landscapes as well as we should, and we are certainly not paying respect for their historic importance. And if you ask me about sustainability, that is the goal, the thrust of the profession for the 1990s, but also another thrust is the preservation of landscapes. And Robson Square is one of those that may be threatened if something isn't maintained properly. Then to maintain and enhance distinctive environments, to enhance the city, its cityness, leave the country, its countryness, and protect the wild of the wilderness. And of course, to reflect and respect the unique ecology of each area and its prevailing climate, bringing to it those colors, textures, and forms that are indigenous and suitable for its particular landscape. And there we touch on why there should be schools in certain areas, you see, that is important. To balance nature and man-made materials throughout the landscape with sympathetic reflection of the changing aesthetic and technical demands of our community, supporting sustainable development and environmental balance. To create designs that will encourage and support the use of open spaces throughout the 4 seasons, as well as day and night for all users, young and old, from birth to very old age, signifying the dignity of all people. Nature, after all, is this ultimate celebration of life. Landscape architects today have at their disposal the experience and technical ability to enhance our contacts with nature in an infinite variety of approaches. We have the knowledge and the technology necessary to keep a city green. We have at our disposal highly developed growing media and such techniques as drip irrigation and slow-release fertilizers. New, hardier, and sturdier plant materials are constantly being developed by the nursery trades. Landscape architects today enjoy large accumulated experience in the selection of plant material that can withstand the stress of the urban environment and stresses on different climatical demands. Like, for instance, I'm working up at Yellowknife. Nothing grows there than what I saw, like the bearberry and the wild rose. And so I went up there with a plant collector and a seed collector, brought all the seeds back to Vancouver, and from these genetically acclimatized seeds. We're raising the plants and bringing them back to Yellowknife next June. So that is another facet of the profession. We have to know how to green rooftops and atrium spaces, as well as preserve natural habitats in metropolitan areas. What we need today is a new crop of multidisciplinary landscape architects trained to think conceptually and perceptually to keep pace with our fast-changing times, which challenges us daily to find new, aesthetically pleasing solutions, ecologically and technically sound ones, while satisfying social and economic goals. The best advice for designing open spaces comes to us from an anonymous Japanese court noble who wrote a book in the 11th century called Sakuteki, in which he provides simple advice to the creators of gardens. Begin by considering the lay of the land and water. Study the works of past masters and recall the places of beauty that you know. Then, on your chosen site, let memory speak and make it into your own, that which moves you most. This advice is still true today and ought to guide us in our efforts in designing the livable and healthy and green city, where architecture and trees can meet in harmony to refresh us from the stresses of urban life. That was my lecture in Tokyo. Elizabeth thinks she'd copied.